So I reached out to Charlie Copeland. Charlie Copeland is a former state senator, former president of the the Intercollegiate Scholastic Institute, small business owner, all around a decent and smart guy, because he wrote a piece in the Caesar Rodney Institute, on their website rather, and its title is House Bill 91, Expanded Powers for Attorney General is Offensive to Public Policy. Charlie, thanks for being on.
Hey, Rick, it's a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
All right, man. So I want to read just from this because I was talking about this the other day. A listener said, did you know that Charlie Copeland wrote about this at Caesar Rodney? I said, no, I didn't know that. And he sent it to me, and I think you did and others. Here is how it begins, and I want you to explain this for us. This bill that the Attorney General just loves would add the words unfair practice, loosely defined as offensive to public policy, to the state's existing Consumer Fraud Act. Why, Charlie, everybody's against unfair practices. Why, we don't want things that are offensive to public policy. Why are you so opposed to such good language like that?
Well, first of all, what is offensive to public policy? And if you start there, that's actually where I started, and I looked back at Delaware court cases going back decades, to the 1920s, looking for the term offensive to public policy in their decisions. And how the court seems to use the term is to reference back to state code when something is either specifically or in the aggregate illegal or wrong according to what is public policy in code. So the courts, of course, look to code and say, so it is a term used by the court to say, what you're doing here, we're going to stop you because it's offensive to public policy, and here's the public policy section, Title 12, Section 23, whatever, that you're violating, and therefore, so it's a reference starting at the back end that a court uses. But to put it into code and say, we don't want you to do something that's offensive to public policy. Code is public policy. Right. That's where you define it. So she kind of, the bill, because I don't know who specifically drafted it, says, we want to put unfair practice into the existing code that was written and voted on in 1965, and we're going to define unfair practice generically as offensive to public policy. So, it's a little bit it's circular, right? If you're offensive to public policy, you're an unfair practice, and if you're unfair practice, you're offensive to public policy, and if you're offensive to public policy, you're unfair practice, which means that you can define it any way you want. And so,
well, it sounds to me, though, if I'm going to take the devil's advocate, and I will, all it's saying is we want to look to Delaware code to make sure you're not doing anything that's offensive to public policy, meaning it's not illegal.
Right. So what you should do is reference the Delaware code. So what is offensive to public policy? Murder is offensive to public policy. Committing fraud is offensive to public policy. Those are in code saying you can't do these things. And if you do them, here are the punishments and penalties that we can apply to you for you to do them. So you have to define what offensive to, because it is used as a reference back, not as a reference forward. I know this gets a little wonky.
No. I get it. I get it, Charlie, but I'm going to debate you on this a little bit because you just said, and using your own words here, that it refers back to that which is already determined to be public policy. So what's wrong with this? All it does is say, unfair practice is that which is defined as offensive to public policy. So there's nothing changed here, or is there?
So, but if inside of the code, it says that if any act by any person that is an unlawful act means it's offensive to public policy, right?
Right.
So right now, public policy, there's a minimum wage, and if I say, I don't think there should be a minimum wage, or I think it should be higher, or I think it should be lower, is that now that's an act that is talking about an area of code And maybe I misrepresent my position a little bit, or maybe I do it out of ignorance. And I say, well, gee, a lot of people are going to lose their jobs if you go from $7.50 to $15. And they say, well, that's offensive to public policy because we want to raise that rate. And so I'm going to now take you to court because you're doing something that is offensive to public policy.
So what you're saying is it doesn't actually have to be in the code for it to be public policy, right? So our public policy here with the Democratic Party, for example, would be to have $15 as a minimum wage. But that's not yet codified. It's just our public policy, even though the bill hasn't passed. And if the bill hasn't passed, why Attorney General Kathy Jennings, who in my opinion is obviously running for governor with this legislative agenda, will prosecute you, and then I can hold it up as a banner saying, vote for me in 2024? Is that kind of what you're talking about here?
And yes, and I can already hear some of your listeners going, well, Charlie, that's a bunch of malarkey. Nobody's going to do what you say. Right. Nobody's going to say that. Well, and I would agree with you, except the bill goes a little bit further. And the bill says that we want to add the ability to look to the codes of other states in order to enforce this segment of code. So that even though today Delaware's minimum wage is whatever Delaware's minimum wage is, and as a small business guy, I honestly don't know what it is because I don't pay it. Everybody gets more than that. But let's say there's a minimum wage in another state that's higher than ours. Mm-hmm. Well, we can use the code from other states to enforce this act.
Wait a minute. In this bill, it doesn't say defined as offensive to Delaware public policy, does it? It simply says offensive to public policy. And then in the same bill, they refer to public policies in other states. And so now we're expanding the prosecutorial powers of the Attorney General, Kathy Jennings, whom I believe is doing this because she wants to run for governor. And she can use the policy of California, for example, or San Francisco, whatever, to say, see, you're not paying $15 an hour. That's offensive to public policy because this bill says we can actually refer to public policy of other states or cities.
Correct. It says interpretations of similar unfair practice definitions in other United States jurisdictions should be considered in determining whether a practice constitutes an unfair practice under this section. So in other words, she's saying, or the bill is saying, again, I don't know who wrote it, so I know who put it in, but it says you should use the laws of other United States jurisdictions, other states, when determining what's an unfair practice, what is offensive to public policy.
Yeah, that's offensive. To me.
So you now have the ability to basically go fishing for a violation.
If you just don't like somebody, or if it might prove valuable to you in some political way.
Correct.
I mean, that's not to say that is what they're doing, but it is to say that that's what someone can do.
That's right. And I find nowhere else in Delaware code where the Attorney General has been given the authority to use 49 other states, plus the District of Columbia, Guam, American Samoa, whatever that jurisdiction is.
Well, think about this. Are there states that have certain laws that would be different from Delaware and should be different from Delaware because they have different societal needs? Alaska, Hawaii, or maybe they simply have different societal desires, like California. So could these states possibly be different from Delaware, and then maybe their laws need to pertain to those particular states and not necessarily to Delaware?
Of course. I mean, San Francisco, probably a $15 an hour minimum wage in San Francisco is probably still too little. But yet in West Virginia, that's way too much, right? Because different states have different levels of need, different sizes. I mean, Delaware, you can get out of the state in 20 minutes in almost any direction. where in California, you could drive for hours and still be in California. And so the needs of that diverse geographic area, and I mean, even Delaware, we have the northern area, which is very urban, and then the southern area, which is more rural and beach. I mean, they have different needs. And so different laws may be appropriate for those different areas and different punishments relative to those laws.
You know, if somebody in the Department of Justice here in Delaware just has it in for someone, and that happens once in a while, oh my gosh. I mean, think about Governor Ruth Ann Minner and how she had political enemies within her own party. Hello, Karen Peterson. Things like that. If they want to go and get somebody, and they can get somebody, and I know because she tried to get me fired and cancel me a couple of times. So people sometimes will be small-minded, but they have large bully pulpits, and they can go and get people. I can imagine someone being angry at somebody here who opposes them politically, and maybe they own a grocery or something, and they sell fish. And so what they can say is, they have laws in Alaska on how to handle salmon, and it's not being followed here in Delaware. Now we can prosecute that person here and disparage their reputation, ruin their reputation, saying that they are not following public policy. They're endangering lives here and what they'll do is they'll use some kind of code from Alaska to do that as a political weapon. People listening might be laughing at that right now, and I would be too, saying, dude, what are you talking about? But that sort of thing really is not so out of hand that it could never occur. So that's the kind of thing you're talking about, preventing something as absurd as what I just described that could possibly happen. I would hope it wouldn't, but if you have people who are of different parties, and you've got a Republican here, for example, who's making inroads and has a couple of, successful grocery stores, you could find some way to get out there and get the headline out there and disparage that person. Let me ask you this.
You could file a cease and desist order. You could, the punishment could be you are not allowed to be open until you comply.
Yeah. And by the way, folks, why did Jensen say grocery store? Because that's real. We do have some powerful people here, smart and I don't know, just smart and influential, who are at policy odds with each other. I mean,
well, and the funny thing about the bill is, first of all, the synopsis itself is longer than the bill. And former state rep years ago, Joe DePinto, who served for many, many years, really good guy out of the city of Wilmington. And he once said to me, and I know he said it to some others, if the synopsis is longer than the bill, it's just easier to vote no.
Okay.
Because you're trying to explain away something that maybe doesn't need explaining.
So you were in politics. Look, you ran for lieutenant governor along with Bill, who ran for governor, and then you're in the Senate. You worked in the House. You were Senate Minority Leader. You've worked obviously president and chair of the Intercollegiate Scholastic Institute. You know policy. So, what are your main concerns about this, and how it could easily be abused for political gain?
So we have this is under the Consumer Protection area, the Consumer Fraud Act. And this act was originally passed in 1965. I was 2 years old. I'm 58 now, so maybe I was even three, whatever. I was two. And the synopsis says, back when this was done, there was an oversight, and they wanted to have unfair practices in there as well. And so for 56 years, we've been operating through 9 different attorneys general with a Consumer Fraud Act that allegedly had an oversight. I mean, that's just silly to even make that as an argument. And then it goes through and it talks about that we need to align with other states that prohibit use of unfair or unconscionable acts or practices in commerce. Well, our law does that. As a matter of fact, it bans unlawful practices. So, I mean, and by the way, we used to be in the top 10 of Delaware of nations in our Institute for Legal Reform, and only dropped out of the top 10 We used to be number one, but we only dropped out of the top 10 back in like 2018. So it then references a bunch of other states that, quote unquote, have similar law or similar structure to their law. And I looked up 4 of the states they referenced, and none of them do. So it seems to me that this is a bill being written that somebody's got a specific interest in mind of grossly expanding the power of the Attorney General's office. And the Attorney General has the power to press charges, to subpoena and suborn witnesses, to put people into prison, to shut down their business operations, to make them spend tens of thousands of dollars on legal counsel.
Well, let me interrupt, because we're running out of time here. Do you suspect that they have a specific target in mind?
I really don't know. All I can say is that you're taking a bill, a law that has existed for 55 years, 56 years, and seems to have done pretty well. Delaware's in a pretty good spot when it comes to consumer protections, in my opinion, and grossly expanding it with lots of stuff being thrown up on the wall, lots of smoke, trying to hide this fact, and then to say we can use any other state we want to press this law onto people.
It's absurd. It's absurd. I want to leave this with an opinion that it just came to me listening to you, and that is this: if you have lawmakers here in Delaware, if you have an attorney general here in Delaware that are really worried about consumer protection, then what you do is you create an office of inspector general that can actually protect people against the state of Delaware and its various departments and agencies, because that's what they do in other states, okay? Here in Delaware, it is the articulated duty of the Attorney General, the State Attorney General, to protect these agencies from abuse by other people. We don't have an Office of Inspector General to actually protect people from abuse by the government. If they're sincere about this sort of thing with consumer protection, that's what they need to do. And that office, by the way, can be self-funding within like 2 to 5 years, as they do in Louisiana and New Jersey. Charlie Copeland, I appreciate the time. Thank you for your insights. And please always reach out to me when something like this occurs to you.
Awesome. Thanks, Rick.